I've spent more than 3 decades sitting behind this bench. In that time, I have watched people walk into my courtroom wearing expensive suits and carrying attorneys who cost more per hour than some families earn in a month. I have watched frightened mothers sit beside defendants they loved. I have watched fathers lie for their children. I have watched wealthy people assume that money could turn an obvious wrong into a complicated misunderstanding. And I have watched people with almost nothing walk through those same doors carrying more dignity than everyone else in the room combined. But on the morning of March 18th, at exactly 9:42 a.m., a young man named Ethan Mercer walked into my courtroom believing he was there because someone had embarrassed his family. He was not there because his family had been embarrassed. He was there because of what he had done to a homeless Vietnam veteran outside a downtown restaurant. Ethan was 29 years old. His father was a billionaire, and the man Ethan had humiliated was 76 years old, living in a small shelter across town, carrying everything he owned in a worn canvas bag. Ethan arrived that morning wearing a $6,000 suit. The veteran arrived wearing a donated blue jacket. Ethan had a private attorney. The veteran had a court-appointed lawyer. Ethan arrived in a black luxury SUV. The veteran arrived on a city bus. And Ethan believed that difference meant something. He believed it meant he was the important person in the room. He believed it meant the other man was beneath him. What Ethan did not know was that the elderly man sitting quietly in the second row had a connection to his own family that nobody had told him about. And when I finally revealed that connection, Ethan's entire expression changed. Not gradually, not slowly, all at once. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, let me tell you something about the man Ethan thought was worthless. His name was Daniel Brooks. I've spent more than 3 decades sitting behind this bench. In that time, I've watched people walk into my courtroom wearing expensive suits and carrying attorneys who cost more per hour than some families earn in a month. I have watched frightened mothers sit beside defendants they loved. I have watched fathers lie for their children. I have watched wealthy people assume that money could turn an obvious wrong into a complicated misunderstanding. And I have watched people with almost nothing walk through those same doors, carrying more dignity than everyone else in the room combined. But on the morning of March 18th, at exactly 9:42 a.m., a young man named Ethan Mercer walked into my courtroom believing he was there because someone had embarrassed his family. He was not there because his family had been embarrassed. He was there because of what he had done to a homeless Vietnam veteran outside a downtown restaurant. Ethan was 29 years old. His father was a billionaire, and the man Ethan had humiliated was 76 years old, living in a small shelter across town, carrying everything he owned in a worn canvas bag. Ethan arrived that morning wearing a $6,000 suit. The veteran arrived wearing a donated blue jacket. Ethan had a private attorney. The veteran had a court-appointed lawyer. Ethan arrived in a black luxury SUV. The veteran arrived on a city bus. And Ethan believed that difference meant something. He believed it meant he was the important person in the room. He believed it meant the other man was beneath him. What Ethan did not know was that the elderly man sitting quietly in the second row had a connection to his own family that nobody had told him about. And when I finally revealed that connection, Ethan's entire expression changed. Not gradually, not slowly, all at once. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, let me tell you something about the man Ethan thought was worthless. His name was Daniel Brooks. Daniel was 76 years old. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding attention. He didn't ask people for money unless he absolutely needed it. He didn't tell strangers about his military service. He didn't wear his medals around town. And when people passed him on the sidewalk without looking at him, he usually let them. Daniel had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic. He came home with injuries that never completely healed and memories he rarely discussed. For nearly 30 years after returning home, he worked as an emergency medical technician. He had helped raise 2 children. He had been married for 41 years. He had volunteered at a community food pantry. And for more than a decade, he had quietly delivered meals to elderly people who could no longer leave their homes. And then his wife died. A few years later, medical bills and a failed business venture involving his son left him with debts he could not recover from. Daniel eventually lost his house. He refused to move in permanently with his daughter because she was raising 3 children in a small apartment, and he didn't want to become another burden. So he moved into a veterans shelter. He had very little but he still had one thing he refused to surrender: his dignity. Every morning, Daniel walked 6 blocks from the shelter to a small public park. He sat on the same bench. He drank coffee from a paper cup, and he watched the city wake up. That was where this story began. On the morning of March 12th, Daniel was sitting outside a restaurant called Belmont's. He wasn't begging anyone for money. He wasn't bothering customers. He was waiting for the Veterans Center to open because he had an appointment that morning. A restaurant employee had given him a cup of coffee. Daniel was sitting quietly near the entrance when Ethan Mercer walked out. Ethan had just finished breakfast with 2 friends. They were laughing. They were dressed for work. What happened next was captured by a security camera mounted above the restaurant's front door. That camera would become the most important piece of evidence in my courtroom. Ethan walked over to Daniel. He pointed toward the sidewalk. He told him to leave. Daniel calmly explained that he was waiting for transportation to the Veterans Center. Ethan didn't care. According to 3 witnesses, Ethan told Daniel that people like him were making the neighborhood look bad. Daniel tried to stand, but before he could finish gathering his things, Ethan reached down and knocked the canvas bag out of his hand. The bag hit the pavement. Daniel's belongings spilled across the sidewalk: a folded shirt, a small medication bottle, a paperback Bible, a photograph of his late wife, and a worn military discharge document. Daniel bent down to collect them. That's when Ethan made his biggest mistake. He kicked the photograph. It slid several feet across the pavement. Daniel looked at him, and according to the witnesses, he said only 4 words: "Please leave her alone." Ethan laughed. Then he said something that would later be repeated in my courtroom: "You don't tell me what to do?" He looked toward the restaurant entrance. Then he looked back at Daniel. "Do you even know who my father is?" Daniel said he didn't. Ethan smiled. "My father owns half the buildings on this block." Then he walked away, but he wasn't finished. A few seconds later, he turned around. He walked back toward Daniel, and he shoved him. Daniel fell backward against a concrete planter. He struck his shoulder and the side of his head. His injuries were not life-threatening, but they were serious enough to require medical treatment. A restaurant employee called 911. A customer retrieved Daniel's photograph from the pavement, and Ethan got into his SUV and left. He probably thought that was the end of the story. It wasn't. 3 days later, Ethan Mercer walked into my courtroom, and he still believed he was the victim. I remember looking at him when he entered. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even angry. He looked bored. That is a difficult expression to forget. There are defendants who are terrified when they enter a courtroom. There are defendants who cry. There are defendants who can't look at the victim. Ethan Mercer did none of those things. He walked in as though someone had interrupted his morning. His attorney followed behind him carrying a leather briefcase. Ethan sat down. He crossed one leg over the other, and he smiled. I looked down at the case file. State versus Ethan Mercer. Assault. Criminal mischief. Harassment of a vulnerable adult. I looked at the defendant again. Mr. Mercer. Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand why you're here? He nodded. Yes. Tell me. His attorney immediately leaned toward him, but Ethan spoke anyway. There was an incident. An incident. That's what he called it. Not an assault, not an attack, not an act of humiliation. An incident. I asked him whether he was admitting that he had confronted Daniel Brooks outside Belmont's. His attorney answered, "We're prepared to argue that my client was responding to an aggressive individual who had been disturbing patrons." I looked toward Daniel. He was sitting quietly in the second row. His blue jacket was buttoned all the way to the top. His hands were folded. He wasn't looking at Ethan. I asked the attorney whether he had seen the security footage. He said yes. I asked whether his client had seen it. He hesitated, and then he said yes. I asked for the footage to be played. The courtroom became quiet. The video showed Daniel sitting peacefully near the entrance, then Ethan walking toward him, the argument, the bag falling, the photograph sliding across the pavement. Daniel bending down. Is that Mr. Brooks? Yes. Did you kick his belongings? He shrugged. Yes. Did you push him? Another shrug. Yes. I leaned forward. Then perhaps you can explain to me why your attorney described this as an interaction with an aggressive individual. Ethan smiled. Because he was in the way. Those words changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. I looked at him for several seconds. In the way of what? My vehicle. I glanced at the security footage again. Mr. Brooks had been sitting more than 20 feet from Ethan's vehicle. I looked back at Ethan. Mr. Mercer, did Mr. Brooks threaten you? No. Did he touch you? No. Did he damage your property? No. Then what exactly was he doing that required you to approach him? Ethan leaned back. Your Honor, with respect, this is being blown way out of proportion. There it was. The first sign that he still didn't understand. I told him that a 6-year-old man being knocked to the pavement was not a matter I intended to minimize. His attorney tried to interrupt. I stopped him. Then I asked Ethan, why did you tell this man that your father owned the buildings on that block? Ethan looked at me. Because he didn't know who he was dealing with. I removed my glasses. Mr. Mercer, do you understand that your father's wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the facts before this court? He smiled again. Of course. But then he made a mistake. He said, my father can resolve this. I looked at him. Resolve what? He gestured around the courtroom. This entire thing. His attorney closed his eyes for a moment. I asked, how? Ethan shrugged. He knows people. I said nothing. He continued. The restaurant owner knows him. The police know him. The district attorney knows him. Then he looked directly at me. Everybody knows my father. I leaned back. Mr. Mercer, your father's name may open doors in this city. I paused, but it does not open this courtroom. For the first time that morning, Ethan stopped smiling. I turned toward Daniel. Mr. Brooks, would you please come forward? Daniel stood slowly. He walked toward the front. He had a slight limp. When he reached the witness area, he stopped. I asked him whether he was comfortable speaking. He nodded. I asked him what he wanted from the court. His answer surprised me. I don't want his money. Ethan looked up. Daniel continued. I don't want his father to lose his job. He paused. I don't want that young man in prison for the rest of his life. Ethan's attorney looked relieved, but Daniel wasn't finished. I just want him to understand that the people he thinks are invisible are still people. The courtroom went completely silent. Daniel looked down at his hands. He told me about the photograph. He explained that it was the last photograph he had of his wife. He had carried it for 11 years. He said the picture had been damaged when it hit the pavement. Then he said something that stayed with me. That photograph mattered more to me than anything else in that bag. He paused, but what hurt most wasn't that he kicked it. He looked toward Ethan. It was the way he looked at me while he did it. Ethan stared at the floor. For the first time, I saw something different on his face. Not remorse, not yet, but discomfort. I asked Daniel whether he had served in the military. He nodded. Vietnam. How long? 2 tours. I asked whether he had ever received any military decorations. He hesitated. Then he said, I received a Bronze Star. Ethan looked up. I watched his expression. He clearly had not known. Daniel didn't mention it proudly. He said it almost apologetically. I don't talk about it much. I asked him why. He said, because a lot of people served. I was just one of them. That was when I noticed something in the case file. A notation from the Veterans Center. I read it again. Then I looked at Daniel. Mr. Brooks, did you work as an EMT after you returned from Vietnam? He nodded. 30 years. I asked him where. He told me, and then I understood something that Ethan did not. Daniel had saved lives for 3 decades. He had treated accident victims. He had responded to fires. He had worked night shifts. He had helped strangers on their worst days. And now, after a lifetime of service, he was sitting in my courtroom because a wealthy young man had decided he was an eyesore. I turned back to Ethan. "Mr. Mercer." He looked up. "I want you to look at Mr. Brooks." Ethan hesitated. Then he did. "That man you thought was in your way spent 30 years responding to emergencies in this city." I paused. "People called him when they were bleeding." I continued. "People called him when their children were injured. People called him when their parents stopped breathing. And you decided he was beneath you because he was sitting outside a restaurant with a canvas bag?" Ethan said nothing. I asked him whether he knew what was inside that bag. He shook his head. I told him. That bag contained his medication, his Bible, his wife's photograph, and the only military records he still carries with him. Ethan looked at Daniel. Then he looked at the floor. But there was still one thing he didn't know, and that was the reason I had asked the court clerk to bring a particular document into the courtroom. I held up a folder. "Mr. Mercer, do you know the name Thomas Mercer?" His face changed. "My grandfather." "Yes." I opened the folder. "Your grandfather founded Mercer Development." Ethan nodded. "He built the company your father inherited." I turned another page. "Do you know who treated your grandfather after his heart attack in 1998? Ethan said nothing. I looked toward Daniel. Daniel lowered his eyes. Then I said, "Mr. Brooks." Ethan froze. The courtroom was silent. I explained that 26 years earlier, Thomas Mercer had collapsed at a construction site. An ambulance arrived. Daniel Brooks was the EMT who treated him. Daniel had performed CPR while waiting for the helicopter. He had stayed with Thomas throughout the transfer. He had helped keep him alive. And according to the hospital records, Thomas Mercer later told his family that the EMT who saved his life was one of the reasons he got another 20 years with his wife. Ethan stared at Daniel. "You saved my grandfather." Daniel nodded. "I was doing my job?" Ethan looked stunned. I continued, "Your grandfather never forgot him." Then I placed another document on the bench, a letter. It was dated 1999. It was from Thomas Mercer. The letter thanked Daniel for saving his life. At the bottom was a handwritten sentence. I read it aloud. "If you ever need anything, call me." Daniel never called. Not once. He didn't ask the Mercer family for money. He didn't ask for a job. He didn't ask for favors. He simply continued living his life. And 25 years later, Thomas Mercer's grandson knocked him to the ground because he thought he didn't belong outside a restaurant. I looked at Ethan. "Do you understand now?" His eyes were red. He nodded. But I wasn't finished. I told him something that I wanted him to remember for the rest of his life. "You thought your father's money made you important?" I paused. "Your grandfather's life was saved by a man you couldn't even be bothered to look at." Ethan covered his face with both hands. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. Ethan pushed it away. Then he stood. "Mr. Mercer," I said. He looked at me. "Do not mistake your embarrassment for remorse." He nodded. I told him to sit down. He did. I asked whether he wanted to address the court. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he stood again. He looked at Daniel, and his voice was different. "I don't know what to say." Daniel didn't respond. Ethan continued. "I thought you were nobody." Daniel looked at him. "And I was wrong." That sentence was simple. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It wasn't something a lawyer had written. It was the first honest thing Ethan had said that morning. He apologized for kicking the photograph. He apologized for pushing Daniel. And then he said something that surprised everyone. "I want to replace the photograph." Daniel shook his head. Ethan continued, "Not because the judge told me to." He swallowed. "Because I destroyed something I had no right to touch." Daniel finally spoke. "You can't replace that photograph." Ethan looked down. "I know." Daniel paused. "But you can become someone who wouldn't do it again." I looked at both men, and I knew then that the case was no longer simply about punishment. It was about whether accountability could accomplish something that humiliation never could. I found Ethan Mercer guilty on the charges before the court, but I did not sentence him to a lengthy prison term. Instead, I ordered him to complete 250 hours of community service with the city's Veterans Outreach Program. He was required to spend at least one day each week working directly with homeless veterans. not writing checks, not donating money, not sending an assistant. He would serve meals, help organize appointments, assist with transportation, clean the facility, and listen. He would also complete 6 months of counseling focused on anger, entitlement, and responsible decision making. And there was one additional condition. He had to return to my courtroom in 6 months and tell me, in his own words, what he had learned. Ethan nodded. Then I looked at Daniel. I asked whether he wanted to say anything. He stood. He looked at Ethan, and he said, "Don't do this because you're afraid of the judge." Ethan listened. "Do it because someday you're going to have everything taken away from you except the person you've become." Daniel sat down. I gave Ethan one final instruction. "Mr. Mercer, you walked into this courtroom believing your family's money made you better than someone who had nothing." I paused. "Today, you learned something your money could never have taught you. That man you looked down on may have had less money than you, but he had something you did not. Perspective." 6 months later, Ethan Mercer returned to my courtroom. He was not wearing the $6,000 suit. He wore a plain shirt. His hair was shorter. He walked into the courtroom carrying a stack of folders, and he looked nervous. This time, genuinely nervous. I asked him how the veterans program had gone. He said, "I thought I was going there to help people." He paused. I ended up realizing I was the one who needed help. He told me about a veteran named Robert who had spent years sleeping in his car. He told me about a former Marine who refused to ask anyone for assistance because he felt ashamed. He told me about a widow who came into the center every Thursday because she had nobody else to talk to. And then he told me about Daniel. Apparently, Daniel had never asked Ethan for special treatment. He had simply continued his volunteer work. One Tuesday afternoon, Ethan arrived early. Daniel was already there. They sat together for nearly an hour. Ethan told him about his grandfather. Daniel told him stories about the man, stories Ethan had never heard. Thomas Mercer had apparently once sent Daniel a Christmas card every year for a decade. Daniel had kept every one. Ethan asked why. Daniel said, "Because your grandfather remembered." Ethan became emotional when he told me that. He said, "I realized that morning outside the restaurant that I had inherited his money." He paused. "But I hadn't inherited his character."